Chicago called CSIP, Chicago, no, it's now called, I can't remember what the C's for, Conservation and Sustainability Interfaith Partnership. It's run out of the real estate office in the Archdiocese of Chicago. And basically what this program will do is it's going to try to help an entire diocese, or at least a large cluster of parishes and schools in a diocese, to look at all of the things that they can do to lower the facility footprint. There's like 70,000 buildings that are owned by the Catholic Church in the United States. If we could reduce energy use through conservation by just 10%, think of the enormous lowering of that carbon footprint, and what a witness that would be to the Catholic community. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with the free stuff. Utility companies are mandated by law, and because it's less expensive than building a new power plant, utility companies are practically giving away light bulbs, LED bulbs. They will come in and do an extensive energy audit for your parish or school. And then we hope to begin a green revolving loan fund where you can actually borrow a little bit of money to do something that the parish wouldn't have, the funds that the parish wouldn't have, and then use that money, once you begin to lower those energy bills, you can actually pay that loan back through the savings. So we're looking at those types of programs. We're looking at solar programs. We're looking at all kinds of things. And we're going to pilot all of this in the Archdiocese of Cincinnati, and hopefully it'll be a model for other dioceses as well. One other thing that we've had for the last 6 years is a climate ambassador program where we have actually brought in, people have applied to get into the program. We bring them in for a weekend, lay folks for the most part, to train them on how do you talk about climate change in the Catholic context. And then they go out and give talks to parish halls, to schools, to other groups. But they're certified, so they go through our program so that it's not someone who's Catholic but mostly involved with the Sierra Club. Rather, they're actually trained by us, and they're endorsed by the Bishops' Conference to go out and give these talks. So we're hoping to expand that program as well. So those are just some of the resources that we have. But let me just try to close this out by having us focus on the Eucharist a little bit. I think what we need is a new way of looking at the world. I think what we need to see is that instead of raw materials, seeing the world as raw materials for our consumption, how about seeing the bounty of the earth as a gift from the Creator and meant for all? Instead of seeing humankind as apart from creation, what if we saw ourselves as part of creation? This is really the truth. We really are stardust. About 60% of our bodies is made up of hydrogen. And that hydrogen came from the first 400 million years of the beginning of the universe. That's pretty astounding to think about. And through the Eucharist, through our unity with Jesus Christ, the source and summit of our faith, we are also part of the fullness of creation. And Pope Francis goes at this notion as well. And again, from Laudato Si, he says this: in the Eucharist, fullness is already achieved. It is the living center of the universe, the overflowing core of love and inexhaustible life. Joined to the incarnate Son present in the Eucharist, the whole cosmos gives thanks to God. Indeed, the Eucharist is itself an act of cosmic love. Yes, cosmic, because when it is celebrated on the humble altar of a country church, the Eucharist is always in some way celebrated on the altar of the world. The Eucharist joins heaven and earth. It embraces and penetrates all of creation. The world which came forth from God's hands returns to Him in blessed and undivided adoration. In the bread of the Eucharist, Pope Francis continues, creation is projected towards divination, towards the holy wedding feast, towards unification with the Creator Himself. Thus, the Eucharist is also a source of light and motivation for our concerns for the environment, directing us to be stewards of all creation. So, here we are in this world that is beginning to look like an immense pile of filth, which is one of the highlighted lines from Pope Francis's encyclical. But we have the right tools, the right structures, the right programs, and the right resources to go out and live out the challenges of Laudato Si. So by gathering and sending, you can be a part of that. You have the ability to change the world. So let's go forth and do that. And join us. Thank you very much. So we have time for some questions, I think. Is that right? And then a break and then a panel. Is that? We have time?
About 15 minutes.
About 15 minutes? Yes?
What do you say to people who say that these kinds of changes in climate have happened over the eons? It's true, but how do you respond to the acceleration I think we see now?
Yeah, so it's true that the world goes in cycles. There's a lot of factors for that. And I think scientists can now go back about 800,000 years and see those cycles through ice cores and things like that. What's different today is that we actually know by the isotope that the CO2 that we're putting in, and other greenhouse gases, methane and so forth, we actually know that comes from burning fossil fuels. When you burn a fossil fuel, the CO2 molecule, I'm not a scientist, this is what I've been told, has a different fingerprint than other CO2. So we know that most of that comes from burning fossil fuels. And we also have never seen in the historical record that they get from these ice cores, we've never seen CO2 concentrations go above about 250 parts per million. So we're now at 400, and it continues to rise. So the scientific evidence for the human contribution to climate change is very clear. What's not clear is what's going to happen. I don't think that any scientist can predict what will happen. We're beginning to see some of that play out. We are beginning to see sea levels rise. We are beginning to see glaciers that have been in place for thousands of years melt at a rapid pace. So we're beginning to see all these indications, as well as measurements that the Earth is warming and that CO2 is the primary culprit. So does that answer your question? Does that help? Yes.
Did you see there was a PBS? I don't know if it was Nova. I only saw a little bit of where it talked about the pH in the seas as being an issue because of the CO2.
Right, yeah, so the CO2 is making the oceans more acidic. Pope Francis actually talks about that in the encyclical. So, and that's trouble, the ocean warming and the CO2 concentrations are spelling trouble for the oceans. For the acid concentrations, it's animals that produce shells. Those shells are weaker because the pH balance is off. And then for the warming, it's bleaching coral reefs and so forth, which is also where much of the sea life has its start, is in these coral reefs. Yes?
Dan, you've been at this for about 10 years.
Yeah.
My question would be, how do you see, especially since Laudato Si, Catholic participation in battling climate change? Because in Western Pennsylvania, there's a lot of action, but the Catholic Church is absent from it. And the Catholic Church doesn't seem willing to even participate with 350 .org and other ecological organizations.
Yeah, so partnering on this with other environmental groups is tricky. Oftentimes their agenda is this is painting a broad brushstroke. So working especially with environmental groups, I think, gets us in trouble with the leaders in our church. Because a lot of environmental organizations, and again, this is I'm generalizing here because not everybody who works in every one of these organizations believe this. But if you go on the website of most environmental organizations, you're going to find something about population, and that population is the problem. That's not the church's teaching, nor is it something that I believe personally. I think consumption is the problem. So until we begin to think about how do we tackle consumption, and this notion that economic progress means consuming more and more, we're going to have a really hard time solving the issue of climate change. So that's why I think, I don't know, there's not a simple answer to your question. Also in Western Pennsylvania, there's lots of jobs, and there's the economic engine in that part of the country is driven by, now, used to be coal mining, now it's fracking. So there's an awful lot at stake for people who are working these jobs, that if the church steps out too far on this in their view, then their jobs are threatened. And you're actually saying you're going to make us poorer by working on this issue. So that it's very complicated and very tricky. That's why I think that what Pope Francis says about dialogue is so important. I think that if the Catholic Church can't do anything else, we ought to be able to bring people together from different points of view. We ought to be willing to convene people, not to apologize for our teachings by any means, but to convene people to say, what's your story? Peabody Cole, I'm picking them. I mean, it could be anybody. What's your story, Sierra Club president? And how can we come together to see if there's an agreement that we can reach? How can we come together to see that not only is our own immediate economic interest at stake, but the future generations are also at stake? And so I think that's the trick, is how do we as pastors, as leaders in this faith community, bring people together to have those really hard discussions. And I think when we do that, we can eventually find some breakthroughs. But it's tough, it's really hard. Now Bernie, you live there, so what's your, do you try to have these conversations with fellow pastors, and what's your experience around that?
Constantly. There is some good news, but just the other day I talked to Father Joe Neely, where we got a picture of diocese, and he told me that they're going to have a session just for priests this October on the Dalkey Sea, and the Dan from Duquesne University,
Dan Scheid. Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
So, we're working on it, but it's strong.
Yeah, and I think we just have to be open, and we have to try to understand where people are coming from. I'll go in the back and then up here.
Yeah, Bob Bono from Youngstown, so we're part of that Western Pennsylvania complex. Industry is coming back a bit to make it to the fracking. And packing that is delicate, but we promote, rather than attacking the fracking, promote the solar and the wind and those
Right.
things that are better.
Right.
So that people don't hear us attacking their life energy, so
Right.
creating those kinds of jobs.
Yeah, there's this whole divest invest movement going on where this is related to what you just said. So there's a bunch of groups saying that Catholic universities, any institution, needs to divest their portfolios from fossil fuel stocks, because we have to leave those fossil fuels in the ground in order to save the planet. And it sends a message out, right? That if we divest from fossil fuels. So I've tried to work on this a little bit through the Catholic colleges and universities, and it's really hard. There's a lot of reluctance to do that. The better approach is exactly what you said. How do we invest? How do we create jobs and value and save money by doing the things that we know we need to do anyway? And I would not even say wind and solar. I would say start with the conservation measures. I don't remember the year it was maybe mid-2000s, but you remember when California they were under a heat spell, and their electricity was skyrocketing. I mean, the usage was skyrocketing in a 2-week period. And the governor of California, who I don't even remember who it was at the time, said, okay, everybody, we have to dramatically reduce the amount of air conditioning that we're used. Overnight, their electric use dropped 11%. And all that was turning up the thermostat a few degrees so that you're not cooling your house to 70, you're cooling your house to 75. And those are the types of things that we need to be looking at. We need to be looking at how can we tighten up our buildings, and then while we're doing that in the parish, let's use it as an education moment for our parishioners. These are some simple, inexpensive things that you can do. When you're replacing your bulb, use an LED. when you're, go out and get a tube of caulk and caulk around the windows and the fixtures and things like that, where air gets in and out of the building. And all of a sudden, you're saving a lot of money without putting anything out. And then you can talk about, okay, can we purchase renewable energy off the grid and promote wind, and can we put solar panels on our church or our school, and how do we do that? And so we have some ideas about how to do that, but honestly, the conservation stuff is the first step we ought to take, because that's where the real savings is, and it's the easiest and cheapest things to do. I think there was a question over here, and then.
Ken Fleck, Association of Chicago Free Chicago, and I'd like to affirm the global warming that I've been a gardener for 57 years now, and for the 13 years I've been at St. George, almost each year the crop has been pushed back. This last season, I picked the last crop around December 10th of radishes out of the ground, and it's most unusual. The point I'd like to make is I've started a program with my children in school and religious education. I call it Seeds of Faith, Harvest of Hope. And we're planting seeds in all of our classrooms. We started that back at the end of February. So we now have tomato and pepper plants growing that they're growing. I'll complement it with things from our greenhouses, and I have two greenhouses on campus, and have the children participate in that and learn. And without going into all of the details, part of the program is that we give away many of the plants and for free, with the condition that half of the plants that you grow, or the number of plants you grow for your family, you have to take an equal number and grow for the food pantry. And every year for at least 8 years, maybe more, we've donated over 1,000 pounds of fresh produce to the local food pantry. Mm-hmm. The point of this whole thing is that it may not solve the problem, but it raises the consciousness of the children at an early age. Also gets them to eat vegetables. Parents are happy with that. But it raises the consciousness, and it gives me an opportunity to speak to parents directly and through their children as well, for the importance of being aware of environmental concerns.
Thank you. Yeah, and do the kids take that back home too? I mean, do they get their parents involved in it? And
I have a couple dozen kids that are in a formal garden club, and we do have instruction with them. I give them materials to
That's
take
great.
home. I'll be meeting with them beginning next week for about 8 or 10 weeks, and just for an hour after school, one time a week, and then we go over different things, and I show them the garden and explain things to them. So I know that we as pastors frequently don't have the interest or the time, but I'm sure that there are parishioners in your parish, especially older ones, who are interested in gardening, who could take something like this over. And on our parish grounds, we've got, I call it the little farm, 3 major plots in which we grow things. And the biggest pride that we had that the kids just really went nuts over was growing baby Huey, a 243-pound pumpkin.
wow, nice. That's great.
Don Wolf, I was pastor for 5 years in the town where they invented fracking, so in Oklahoma. Just a couple of things. One is we can get into trouble talking about things we don't know about, which is the number one thing. So there's all kinds of issues. If I talk about oil production or fracking to a church full of people who do this for a living, I better know what I'm talking about all the time. But the second thing is the things that we do know about include things like the human environment. And I think it's possible also to raise consciousness about what goes on in the world that we're a part of by the kinds of things that we know about, which isn't so much about planting and harvesting usually, but also the kind of world in which we live, in which people become disposable and dispensable. And I think that's another way into the question of what are we here for, and what are we taking care of, and what are we responsible for.
Yeah, good. It is tricky, and I've been at this for 10 years, and I certainly don't know all the sciences I demonstrated just a few minutes ago. But we are, at least as Catholics, we are somewhat experts in human life. I was just reading a piece. It appeared, I think, in the San Francisco Archdiocesan newspaper about the link between I think the headline of the article was natural family planning is also an environmental concern, and the argument was that not only is the pill that that women use impacting the hormonal makeup of our streams and rivers, and therefore the life that lives in those, but there's also this connection that if we're serious about understanding nature and the rhythms as God intended, wouldn't natural family planning be a part of that, right? I mean, so understanding the cycle of the woman and when it's good to have sex, when it's not good to have sex. I mean, all of these things are related, and I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to say, is that all of this is related, and we can't just the technological freight train that's going down the tracks is taking us in directions that we don't want to go. And so he's pushing back on that. And I think the church's teaching around natural family planning and human life and being open to life, I think that's all part of it. And when we don't practice these things, then it leads us to begin to think that if we can do this with human life, we can do this with other types of life as well. How we raise our meat. How we raise our crops, and all of these things, that's all related. And I think that's what Pope Francis is trying to tell us, and I think it's really an important lesson. And our teaching has been just spot on all along. We just need to remind people that that's also part of what it means to be a Catholic environmentalist, if you will. Other questions? Are we done? We're done? Any other? We have one more? Nope. Ready for a break? Get some coffee? Thank you.
As Dan said, time to take a break.